Having made a video on the worst of analog horror, I thought that I should make a video on the worst of analog horror's entities. Seeing as I talk about entities a lot, I think it's on brand for the channel. I'd consider an entity as one of the worst if it's simple, boring, just not creative in the execution of its appearance, supernatural powers, or it's just not as interesting as it could be. However, I do know that a lot of people don't like a series or its entity due to certain controversies the series or its creator has had. So we'll be looking at some of the controversial entities first and then going from there to the other ones. Some of what you'll see are the ones I'd consider to be the worst, and some are what a large audience believes are because I wanted to get a mix of creatures in there. I'll be really focusing on the entity side of things versus if you could survive against them like I usually do. But of course, at the end of the video, I'll do my usual rating of them from least to most powerful. And obviously, I'll be keeping things respectable in my discussions, so I hope you do the same since I'll be linking everything I talk about in the description like I always do. So you can check them out if you want to further formulate any opinions you have or support the creators of the videos we look at. Let me know your opinions on what's discussed in the comments section too. And if you end up enjoying this video, why not consider subscribing so you don't miss out on future uploads. Check out my second channel, Soda Jump, where a friend and I get goofy playing video games and doing some IRL things linked in the description. So, with all of that being said, let's dive into the worst of analog horror's creatures and entities. Let's start things off with Steven Hillenburg's wife from the Nickelodeon Hijacking incident. What a sentence. So the creator of this video is unknown since any trace of the creator and the original video has seemingly been wiped off of the internet. But, lucky for us, we have a re-upload by Aphex Twin Fan 926. I did cover this in a recent video where I talked about surviving the worst of analog horror. I thought it was a bit disrespectful to use Steven's name and character like this, and that's why Steven's wife in the video sits as one of the worst analog horror entities. So, long story short, the Nickelodeon Hijacking was Steven Hillenburg's doing from the dead. At least, that's what I thought. A few of you pointed out that it was actually his wife communicating to him through the hijacking from the grave, and I can definitely see now that that's probably the case. I say probably because the grammar and how the info's presented trips me up a bit, and I'm sure it does to others. It sounds like Steven killed his wife and she's communicating to him and telling him that she'll see him in hell, but it also sort of sounds like his wife killed him and she'll soon see him in hell. Again, it's probably most likely the former. And to top it all off, if you didn't know, Steven passed away back in 2018 due to ALS, a neurological disease that weakens your muscles over time. It's hard to confirm whether or not this video was published before or after his death, but given that analog horror wasn't as mainstream as it is now, it's highly likely that it was made after Steven's death, and it was probably made by some kid who wanted to make something dark. Steven's wife says her piece with some booty cheek tear grammar before seizure-inducing flashing accompanied by screaming and the word "why" flash before our eyes, and we get that infamous "See you in hell, Steven Hillenburg" screen. That whole sequence could have been done a lot better. For starters, she should have elaborated a little more on what Steven did to her and put some more oomph and emotion into it. Give us something more than a generic "we were partners, why?" Establish a mystery with a little more specificity. And those flashing lights, just know that whenever you're seeing it on screen, it's been slowed down so much to not cause seizures or damage to anyone's eyes. I get that it's done to emphasize the questioning and rage of a resentful and restless spirit, but goddamn, it's way too much on the visual senses. And that brings us to the "See you in hell" screen, which I think is a big factor on what makes this entity one of the worst. We wrap around right back to the fact that Steven's name and character were used in this video in a non-flattering way, contrasting to the real-world context of his death. This looks to be in bad taste by the creator, but I don't think there's any malice attached to it. I hope the backlash this video got didn't discourage the creator and they continue to pursue their hobbies or passions, whatever video creation may mean to them. There was potential in this video, seeing as the SpongeBob glitch screen looks great and sounds interesting, but the parts after that with Steven's wife fall very flat, but had potential if written differently. So it's obvious that the creator does have talent, and some changes in the story could have gone a long way, like Steven's wife mourning for him, or some ill-intent Nickelodeon head being the one to initiate the hijacking, which in turn would have created a villain for us to side against, etc. Now, let's take a look at the Smile tapes by Padariku, and long story short, there's a fungus from outer space releasing spores, and those spores affect humans in a way that makes them erratic and smile in a very unnatural way. The spores were first publicly discovered in a brand new drug that hit the streets. Story-wise, things are all good and fine here, but the entities themselves? I would personally include these entities as one of the worst in analog horror just because of their design. Like I've already said, there's nothing wrong with the story here, and they help to push the story very well, but man, they just, look at them, they look so goofy. When I first saw snippets of the Smile tapes and then eventually watched it, I just couldn't take the entities' faces seriously and thus couldn't take them seriously as a whole. The faces created are just too much of an attempt to be scary and fall into that trope of analog horror faces, but without any of the build-up and payoff associated with it. But then again, that trope has gone under scrutiny because of things like this. They look too funny in my opinion, I can't take them seriously, and I don't think I'm alone in saying that. It's 100% the giant grin, and it kills the fear factor for me. I mean, imagine this. You have a fungus that shoots out deadly and infectious spores that physically and mentally damage its host. And before they wither away in a horrid and painful state, one of them throws what you believe to be a bag of flour, but is actually spores, at you, and they look at you like this. It's just a shame, because someone who's been taken over by a fungus, who would also be acting rampant and insane, would be a scary sight to behold, but the way it's presented just doesn't hit like it should. Moving on from there, I want to take a look at another real-world person and their life changed for analog horror. Supizza's The Mccartney Collective series and the character of Paul McCartney in it. Also, is this creator's name meant to be pronounced as Soup Pizza, so Supizza? Or is it like the cute way you can say soup in Greek, Supizza? I just thought I'd point out my observation, but anyway, this is a small series, and when I first stumbled upon it, I was a little confused at first until I read the description, which states, I do not believe this theory, nor am I mocking the genre of analog horror. I am simply using the idea of the theory to create this story. Smiley face. We get some context and clarification, which I don't think was needed, but I understand if Supizza was worried that an internet mob would come after them. But this description here was my introduction to the theory that the famous Paul McCartney of the Beatles band actually died in a car crash in 1966. He was then replaced by a lookalike thanks to the help of Britain's MI5 secret services to spare the public from grief. However, it's believed that the truth was sprinkled throughout the band's music and album covers. Rumors of Paul's health declining and the band possibly splitting around that time aided in the theory. Honestly, this theory is a giant rabbit hole, and I won't get into it, but that's what this whole 2-video analog horror series is about. The first video has John Lennon denying the rumors, and the second is a psyop of sorts where the viewer is trained to quell rumors of Paul's death, and it ends on John stating that it wasn't his fault. However, I do think that Paul McCartney here is one of the worst analog horror entities I've ever seen. Not because the premise of him is terrible, but because he sort of just doesn't do anything. In the 2 videos we're given, only one of them has him doing the analog horror face, you know, the smiling, and that's it. And it's not like the story wasn't interesting either. Conspiracy theories are prime for storytelling. There was a clear setup outlined, and it would have been interesting to have seen where things went. So you could see it as a little unfair to say he's one of the worst, since the series seems to have stopped, or at the very least, been put on hiatus. But in fairness to what we've seen in the series, he's dead, so what could he really do? Haunt the VHS tapes or smile at the viewer? That's the most cookie-cutter thing that could be done. We've seen it 100 times over. So I hope there was something bigger planned in that regard. Hopefully, Supitza does come back because things have been left at a spot where Paul is just a few images, with one being a spooky one you'd see in your typical run-of-the-mill analog horror. I also found this comment in the second video, Staff Information 1/9, the Mccartney Collective. It's been a year, Daddy. I really, really miss you. Okay. From here, I want to highlight two entities that share something in common that people have an issue with. Maybe you can guess what that is, since we'll be taking a look at GÜBY from GÜBY and Friends. In this series, the titular character GÜBY is presented to us in a glitchy and pained state, attempting to teach kids the things you usually see in children's shows. Throughout all of this glitchiness, some of GÜBY's friends appear, but so do missing children with their plights and loss of innocence flashing on screen, being reflected by the glitching. It seems that there's a man dressed as GÜBY outside of the TV show kidnapping children by influencing and somehow manipulating them through the TV show and the GÜBY IP. Which all sounds pretty interesting to me, but what's the catch? Well, if you've ever heard me talk about GÜBY and Friends, then you'll know that I've pointed out before that GÜBY looks a little waxy. You know, just like an AI image. It's not outright confirmed that the human GÜBY and other stills are AI, but it's likely considering how they look. And that's led people to label GÜBY and Friends as one of the worst analog horrors, thus making GÜBY one of the worst entities in their eyes, for the alleged use of AI art. That's the logic I'm rolling with for this video, and I've talked about how I feel about AI images and AI as a whole in my Could You Survive the Worst of Analog Horror video. Basically, I said that I personally don't think that the alleged AI images make GÜBY and the series one of the worst in any way. I think it's actually far from the worst, and everyone has their limits and what's deemed acceptable with AI, and I know that I certainly do. It's really strange that the creator even used AI because they're a very talented artist and animator, as we've seen throughout the series anyway, so I'm not sure why they didn't use those skills when creating the stills that appear throughout the videos. I would have much rather that than the AI images, but it isn't a huge worry to me. But for others, it's a big issue. I understand that for every AI image or video generated, another piece of art or media is made lacking a human soul, or an artist may have lost a job opportunity. Even Harry and I on Soda Jump made an AI image of us gaming, and it's a bit of an abomination. There's just this strange curiosity that comes with pumping prompts and images into an AI and seeing what it churns out. Truly, a moment of science leaving us with moral and ethical boundaries to discuss and either cross or pull back away from. GÜBY as an entity will forever sit there as a reminder of that dilemma, labeled as one of the worst by many. Moving on to our next entities, Liminal Land by the channel of the same name. Just like with GÜBY, this series uses AI images throughout each video, but to a wider extent than with GÜBY. And obviously, this has led people to dislike the series and the entities within them. And when I mean by wider extent, I mean like most, if not every still in this series is an AI generated image, making the entity that is the park and the entities it creates some of the worst in analog horror. At least, there are people out there that have that opinion. Although myself and a lot of other people would agree that the atmosphere and storyline presented to us in these videos are really good. Everything is shown to us in tapes, and the nature of the park and what it does to people is slowly revealed, and as you can see, the AI generated images are eerie and atmospheric, which complements what's trying to be told in the story. But it's like a double-edged sword. The park itself is an entity because it's alive, or at the very least seems to be, or at the very least as well, it has some sort of anomalous powers. And the imperfect AI images help create a picture of a morphing and shifting grotesque park that sits in an uncanny valley of sorts, but for amusement parks. And on top of that, the strange and imperfect morphing affects the park visitors by shaping them into uncanny valley nightmares too. It really does work with the story being told, but on the other side of the double-edged sword, we have the same problem we've seen in the Smile tapes. The reveal of what happens to park goers is very goofy. The uncanny look these faces have are unintentionally funny and take a lot of the scare factor away. There's just something so strange about them that doesn't necessarily scare me, and you can even see AI generated issues. You know, body parts and facial features that aren't generated properly. Are they supposed to be like that to show the audience that the park is changing them for the worse? Or is it just an AI image problem? Again, it helps paint a story, but has an effect of looking strange and goofy. You know, I see these images and I know that it would be scary to see something like this in person, but seeing and knowing that it's an AI image just takes away all that fear factor. It's like there's nothing real about it at all. Plus, AI-generated images just don't sit very well with a lot of people, like I've stated before, and that leaves you with some very divided opinions on everything. Despite that, I do enjoy the series and I hope it's continued because it seems to have been stopped or cancelled altogether. From here, I want to take a look at Tom Through the Window by the Homies. When I was thinking of entities to cover for this video, Tom came to mind because the way he's written is a little perplexing in my eyes. For those who don't know, Tom Through the Window is about the titular characters Tom and Jerry from the Tom and Jerry show, except Tom is more of a bloodthirsty monster. His actions throughout the story are strange, don't make sense, and there's a clear missed opportunity to develop him into something coherent and truly scary. Which is a shame since there's elements of that being possible littered throughout the series. So, he's one of the worst analog horror entities I've seen despite the interesting premise and potential. Things really kick off with Tom in the third video despite there being two before it, but one's just a trailer and the other one is just some fluff. Everything we see and learn about Tom is from the perspective of a neighbor that moved in next to where Tom lives with his owner, Miss Mammy. Right off the bat, we find out that Tom, for some reason, put a bunch of kittens into a sack and drowned them in a river. Why? Who knows, it's never explained and neither is the fact that Tom ends up in heaven too with the kittens. So did Tom drown himself too? But he's clearly flattened in this clip, so what are we supposed to make of it? How does he look like a ghoul here but then like a normal cat elsewhere? I get that clips from the show are used and that's why, but there should be an explanation in the story to immerse us in. And what's with the static that's mentioned in the third video? It's mentioned through Morse code stating the static. He's coming. Which, last time I talked about Tom Through the Window, I said this happens in the first video. Clearly not. And then this static is never mentioned again until the end of the series. This tells us that static is important to Tom as an entity, but we never figure out why, and we can't even properly speculate on it either since we're given nothing to work with. He's a cartoon character, so static from like a TV would make sense to be linked to him, but in this world, he doesn't seem to be part of that TV show. And what about Tom being attracted to alarms? I guess it makes sense since anyone would be curious about the sound of an alarm, but there has to be some sort of interesting explanation, right? What Tom does to the neighbor is weird as well. He just walks into his house, opens the door to his room and stares at him. We can assume it's because the neighbor has been watching Tom through the window. Oh, I see what he did there. I see what the homies did there. But anyway, Tom caught on and that's why he's there. Over the rest of the videos, Tom's behavior is noted to get stranger because he's thought to be unwell, he eventually kills Jerry and Miss Mammy, turns into a monster, and an EAS is made warning the local area of his presence. It's all just said and shown to us in an uninteresting way, except for the reveal of Tom looking through the window. Now that took me by surprise in a very good way. Some more build-up and scares like that could have gone a long way as only Tom's eyes are shown and we're left to imagine what kind of horror he's become hiding in the shadows. But there should have been more of that. I think that's what the series needed from its entity, Tom. Some more horror and thriller aspects integrated into his design and reasons to be interested in what's happened to him and why. The series doesn't lure any sort of mystery or information in front of you to do that, which is a shame. And that brings us to our last entity, the Streetlight Entity from Streetlight by Zenith Initiative. In no way does this creator make bad analog horror videos despite them being in that simple and a bit overused EAS presentation format, but I just think that the entity from the Streetlight video is one of the worst I've ever seen. For some unknown reason to us, these four-armed creatures come out when the sun randomly sets during the day. Why this happens is unknown, but it creates a mystery and setting. Like, do the entities come out when the sun sets normally, and what do they do? That last part is hard to say, but perhaps that's an intentional part of the horror, creating more mystery and what-ifs. After all, not revealing every single detail about something can make it scarier, but with this, there's nothing super imaginative to ponder about. When you look at this creature, you can assume that because it has 4 arms and looks humanoid, it'll be strong, maybe even animalistic or ruthless with its offensive measures. But what else does this tell us? It's red, so it's dangerous, but that's pretty much it. The limiting factor here is the visuals. It just looks like a guy with 4 arms, which sounds dangerous, but in the vast landscape of analog horror, that's as simple as they get. Usually, a humanoid entity would have some sort of factor beyond its physiology to make it interesting, but in this case, we have the sun being that interesting factor, but it's more interesting than the entity itself. The mystery of why the sun disappears for a period of time is bigger than what we can assume these creatures are. Entities, especially if they're the humanoid type that we've seen 100 times over, really need more thought and time put into them to make them a lot more intriguing. I've made a video on that before where I went more in depth with that regarding humanoid entities and the copy-paste formula of it, so check that out if you'd like to. Just for the record, I hope that everything I've said doesn't come off as something with malice or bad intent. I've said what I said as a form of constructive feedback and criticism as a viewer of the analog horror genre. I gave my opinions on some of the entities, but also shared opinions and critiques from a larger group of people that I've seen online. So hopefully we see more from these creators, because wouldn't we all want to see their creations change and improve with time? I for one think that would be great. And with that being said, let's rate the entities we've seen from least to most powerful. As the least powerful, Paul McCartney from the Paul McCartney Collective. What a strange sentence. So what were we able to learn about Paul and what did he do in the 2 videos we saw? Make an analog horror smiley face and that's it. Really, he's just Paul McCartney but dead and might be a ghost haunting the tapes or his former band members. It's hard to say. Far out, man, this is my job, and I love it. From there, we have Steven Hillenburg's wife. Again, what a weird sentence given the context, but just like Paul, all she really does is sort of haunt a piece of technology. Which brings us to GÜBY. He might have some sort of supernatural powers that influences children through the GÜBY and Friends TV show, but he seems to just be a man behind a mask. Although I can't say the same for Tom Through the Window. Who knows why he's attracted to static and alarms, but he seems to just be a big anthropomorphic cat with serial killer tendencies, right? Don't get me wrong, that's dangerous and all, but not as dangerous as the Streetlight Entity. My thoughts behind this is that it has 4 arms, so it's probably stronger, but who knows. There's a lot of questioning here, so honestly, you could swap these 2 around if you wanted. But from there, we have the liminal land entity and the entities it creates. The concept of the park itself is ripe for interest and it's pretty cool, but the execution of the entities and how they look falls flat for some. Despite that, being able to create creatures and grow as a park is one hell of a strong power. Which brings us to the most powerful entity shown in this video, the Smile Tapes entities. Not only does the fungus create comically smiling entities, but it looks like the victims are compelled to further spread the fungus through spores, which might explain why the drug mentioned at the start of the series was made up of spores from a fungus being the fungi from outer space. And same for that one person throwing a bag of what was thought to be flour at their victim. In a situation where we have an alien fungus spreading itself around through spores and creating its own victims to spread itself around, we'd all be doomed. If you've made it this far into the video, thanks for watching. It means a lot to me. Do you agree with my opinions or the opinions of others that I've presented? Let me know in the comments section, and if you have any suggestions for future content, let me know down there too. It seems that some of these creators have gone on to create other videos, which is nice. It's always good to see that criticism or insults haven't beaten them down, because that's not the point of this video or other videos that critique pieces of media. It's always just interesting to break down a video, show, or series and analyze what works and what doesn't. But anyway, like, subscribe, and check out my second channel Soda Jump if you want to see more from me. And as always, we can't forget the shout out to my lovely patrons and YouTube members. And a big shout out to the highest tier Patreon members, Joel Matthew Colgrove and La Creatura. Thank you both for your continued contributions, and thank you to everyone else too. You guys are absolute legends. Stay tuned for more content like this. Everything talked about is in the description if you want to further look into them, and I'll catch ya in the next one.